So today's lecture is on the starting the methods of innovation, neurobiology of learning and creativity. So we're back to biology, but you'll see why it's connected to innovation, not through the evolution concept, but through neurobiology. So we've covered a lot of the fundamentals in history, and now we're starting the second half of the course, which is on methods and applications. And in particular, we're going to start with how the brain works in terms of creativity and innovation. So just very fundamentally, how human beings think, how they learn, and what are the implications of that for yourselves and for whatever organizations you're working with. So that's really the ultimate basis of methods of innovation. All these other techniques build upon how people think and how we learn about things. As we'll see in the lecture, there's a deep connection between learning and innovation. So I've posted on LMS. There were some problems with LMS earlier in the week and so forth. So it was difficult to post, but I posted on LMS the short projects for the end of the semester. These will constitute 60% of the grade. And there are, as you know, 3 short projects, and let's go through them briefly. Due on Friday, June 4th, is a project which I titled Curiosity. We've mentioned curiosity a lot in the history of innovation and in examples of innovation, business and otherwise. And it's very important to have this spirit of curiosity and to be uh, uh, very comfortable going outside your own particular area. So that's what this first project is intended to develop. So to attend a webinar, preferably outside your area of interest, and to write a short paragraph or two as a separate file that you submit in LMS, so you can upload a Word document or a PowerPoint about what you found interesting in this webinar and what you learned. So you might ask, should I assign you a webinar to watch? Now, of course, I gave you the webinar about the chaebols and so forth that was more related to the lecture material. This can be about anything. It's not about innovation. It could be about cooking. It could be about science. It could be about business techniques. It could be about anything, but preferably your choice outside your area of interest. Now, of course, you can cheat and you can say, well, I'm only interested in video games. So I'm going to watch a webinar on video games. And I don't know if you're interested in video games. So you could say, well, I'm tricking the professor. I'm an expert in video games. So I'm going to watch a webinar on video games and write a very nice piece about video games because that's my area of interest. And you will say to yourself, well, I'm really smart because Professor Gurel doesn't know that I'm interested in video games. So I can trick him and I can watch a video about curiosity about video games. Well, that's not really my problem. That's your problem. Because if you watch a video, a webinar about an area that you're already interested in, that's not testing your kind of capability of thinking outside your area. It's not testing your curiosity. So you may get a good grade. You may not get a good grade. I don't regard myself as entirely stupid. So, maybe I will guess that this is your area of interest. It's a risk. But the point is, you should really try yourself to go totally outside your area and get this concept of curiosity. Now, the second question you might ask is, why doesn't the professor assign me a webinar? Well, that's not really curiosity either, because curiosity has to be self-generated. So I'll tell you this, if you send me an email and ask, dear professor, can you assign a webinar to me? And if I assign a webinar and you watch the webinar and you do the assignment, I will fail this assignment for you. You will fail the assignment. So you'll say, wow, that's really stupid. He assigned me a webinar and I did it and it failed. Well, think about it. The point is to have your own internal motivation, your own curiosity to select the webinar. So if I choose the webinar for you, you have by definition failed the assignment, even if you do it. So I'm not going to assign webinars. Don't ask me for a webinar. Just find it on your own. I trust you to do that. This is your opportunity to kind of really push outside. School is often very focused and so forth, and that's good and that's important. But this is an opportunity to really explore something totally different. Uh, and I encourage you to do that as opposed to just trying to trick the system. Again, I'm not saying that you will or any of you will, but I just wanted to set that context because you don't become innovative, you don't become creative by kind of tricking the system. It's really hard and it requires a very powerful, open minded, curious mindset. So if you don't develop that in this project, you have no hope of developing that in the future in anything you want to do, innovative. So think about that. And this should be a very interesting experience and fun experience and eye-opening experience for you and your classmates. Now, I mentioned classmates because this is a written assignment. Normally, this class has 40 students, but somehow they opened it to 60 students. So that makes it very difficult. But I'm committed to still doing this. All of you will present on your topic. So in 3 hours, we have to have 60 people presenting, which means that with some discussion, with the breaks, with the transitions and so forth, all of you have 1 minute to present. 1 minute. That's very difficult. But as you've all heard about, when you do what they call an elevator pitch, you bump into Bill Gates or you bump into Elon Musk in the elevator and he asks what you're doing and you have a startup and you have to say in 30 seconds, 45 seconds about your idea. Maybe they'll give you some funding or something. They're not going to wait 10 minutes. Elon Musk is not going to listen for 2 hours. They will listen for 15 seconds. So this ability to present a key idea, what was the topic of the webinar, what did I watch, what was the key points, and what I found was interesting. That's it. So for 1 minute. So it will be very challenging, um, but I think we will try that as a kind of experiment. 60 people presenting at the end of the class on Friday, June 4th. Second project, the following week, Friday, June 11th. So the project is due on June 4th and you present on June 4th. The second project is about observation. So we talked about Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo and all these great innovators and inventors throughout history, Jang Yong-chil, with King Sejong and all this kind of stuff. And we observed, or rather we noticed, that they have very powerful abilities of observation. They see things that other people do not. Because a lot of the best innovation is actually quite simple and is almost obvious, but somehow people were not seeing it. So this is your opportunity to develop and test and really think about your powers of observation. So take a walk inside, outside your home or whatever office. Keep an eye out for something interesting, strange, and mysterious. And then write a short paragraph or two about why you found this interesting, what new knowledge this strange observation could lead to. You can also share a picture, a video. It could be a thing. It could be about people's behavior. It could be about the weather. It could be about objects in the world. It could be about nature. It could be about biology that you notice something interesting. Anything, just some sort of unusual observation. Now, again, this will be a written separate file, Word or PowerPoint, due Friday, June 11th, on which date we'll also do 1-minute presentations. All of this is on LMS, by the way. And then the last one, which is due on the last day of class, Friday, June 18th, is to exemplify this concept of passion for continuous improvement. So I taught the Einstein webinar, and I talked to the people at Montreal this week, and I'll be presenting that Einstein seminar, and I always want to improve things. I always want to make everything a little bit better. That's just my passion. That's ultimately very important for innovation. And I try to think of ways to improve it. So I wanted to give an interesting webinar for you that you may not see, Einstein and combining science and marketing. And some of you have not taken marketing, so you learn some marketing concepts for the first time by going outside your area. And then I want to improve that presentation for the next time. So I ask also for your input. And so that kind of passion for continuous improvement is essential to any business in general, as well as, of course, innovation specifically. You always want to be improving your products. You always want to be getting more information about your marketing. You want to always be always improving your financial aspects. And often those improvements will require innovation. This is why this course in innovation is so central. And of course, that's not going to happen if you don't have the passion for that kind of improvement. So the idea here is to make an innovative suggestion about improving the online educational experience at Soulbridge. It should not just be a new idea, but also some sort of plan. You shouldn't just say, well, I think we should have better professors. Or I think Zoom is not good, we got to do something better. That's not a really plan. That's not really an idea. That's not really innovation. It's just dreaming. So this passion also has to be some sort of concrete proposal. Again, 1 or 2 paragraphs, a diagram or whatever is enough. And then to talk about that in 1 minute. So this will be very difficult on Friday, June 18th. You have to present in 1 minute. What's the problem? How do we solve it? And what's the plan to solve that problem? So those are the short assignments. Any questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
So I was just wondering about the curiosity assignment. Does it have to be a webinar, or can I attend an in-person class?
Yeah, actually, in-person class is fine too. That's right. I mean, the challenge is many of these things are not as easy in the pandemic, but depending on where you are and if it's safe. Obviously, as a matter of legal liability, I don't want to insist that you go see a live class, because if you get COVID, it's not going to be a good thing for you or me or the school, etc. So my first suggestion is a webinar, but if you have an opportunity, a live class is fine too.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, comments? So this will be 60% of your grade, where the written part will be 30% and the speaking part is 30%, 3 assignments. So each of those is 10%. 10% of your grade. is that submission or that oral presentation for each of the three. Okay, let's have a quick discussion. Um, what method or technique do you find especially helpful to learn things? Anyone want to comment? How do you learn things?
May I say something?
Sure, who's that?
Julia Minks.
Julia Minks. Okay, great.
Yes. So something that one of my teachers at university taught me was to repeat everything within 24 hours. So whenever we learned something in microeconomics or macroeconomics, because I had him in both subjects, he just told us to like look at our notes again and like go through it like in our minds. And I feel like that really helped me because I found that I can still remember like the key points from both of the subjects now in comparison to when I didn't do that, where I just like learned everything I had for the exam and then everything was gone afterwards. So I found that that really helped me.
Great. Well, that's a good idea. What if I told you in today's lecture, which may be not just, this is not just an important class, as I said in the beginning, but this may be the most important lecture in the most important class. But in this lecture, I'll be teaching you a method of learning where you can learn more by learning less. Now, that's not exactly the same thing as learning by being lazy, but I will explain what I mean by that. And this learn more by learning less technique will actually be very important for innovation. So that's a good technique, Julia, but that's not exactly very similar to what I will be presenting as part of this lecture. Any other techniques?
Professor?
Yeah.
I like more to be practical lesson. Like what we have learned, we put it into practice, then it remains in mind for always.
Okay, putting things in practice. What else? Any other methods?
I think
Is that Jian?
Yes. Okay, so for like classes, lectures and tests, I think just highlighting like 20-80 rule and just learn the 20%. And for like real life learning, because it's hard for me to concentrate and just watch a lecture, I have to walk and watch a lecture, and I feel like it's a lot easier for me to absorb the lecture while learning and walking.
Oh, walking. Okay, that's interesting. Thank you. And Masood, you were going to say something?
Well, for me, it's like especially technique is learning about when you learn something by watching, or you can analyze the information what you learned.
Okay, sounds good. Well, let's learn about learning. But first, we're going to do an extremely short, quick review. The Great Divergence we mentioned this last time about how East and West kind of separated, and what are the reasons for this. Physical environment, culture, religion, political, social institutions, markets, technology. Nobody really knows the reasons, but I tried to emphasize that one of the key features of economies and societies that do innovate more than others is this ecosystem idea. That's why I thought it was very important to share that lecture, because in Korea, trying to create an ecosystem is not very easy. It requires people to talk to strangers, and that's just not very easy. But Korea has been very successful, and they've created strong ecosystems. And the chaebol concept, the chaebol system, has in effect enabled this ecosystem idea. So Samsung is a huge company with many different parts. All the different parts can interact with each other comfortably because they're part of the same family in a way. It's easier to go to another Samsung company than just go to some random stranger to make a deal. You know, in Korean language, in Korean culture, you can't even talk to somebody normally if you don't really know who they are, what their age is relative to you. The language depends on the nature of the relationship. So if you don't have a relationship, it just makes it very hard. So creating ecosystems is difficult in Korean culture. Wide, wide, diverse, stranger ecosystems just doesn't come naturally. But the Chaebol concept has been a powerful solution to that, so that you can create globally competitive ecosystems. So I think that's a very important lesson, not just for Chaebols, but for your own kind of concept of innovation. So we talked about some of these ecosystems, such as Silicon Valley, diverse over time and space. We talked about how it's disruption, the different components of the ecosystem, and we talked about the same thing being the case in Israel as well, a kind of amalgam of all sorts of large and small companies and universities, corporate spin-offs, research institutions, defense technology, venture capital, all of these ecosystem elements that come together. So if you're isolated innovator and you're not in an ecosystem, you're not going to be innovative. You will fail in innovation. Uh, so you have to not only build yourself and your company in innovation, you have to find and connect with all these other diverse individuals and groups to implement that innovation. Remember, we said innovation is about implementation. So now let's begin the lecture, which is on the neurobiology of creativity and learning. So we had a lot of biology at the beginning. We talked about evolution, theory of evolution and biological evolution. Now we're returning to biology, but it's a totally different concept. We're not going to talk about evolution. That's the theory of innovation and so forth. We're going to talk about how the brain works and how we have that brain working leads to creativity and learning. We'll talk about some background, some basic neurobiology, and then how learning works, how we learn in the brain. And in particular, there's a phenomenon called long-term potentiation. Potentiation means to increase or improve over a long time. So that's how Julia Minks was saying, how does she remember things for a long time? So by reviewing within 24 hours, what she was doing is in effect facilitating this long-term potentiation process in the brain. And then we'll talk about the mind and creativity. So here's another question for the class, just a few comments, then we'll move forward. What is learning? Anyone want to comment? What is learning? Are you learning right now? So if you're learning right now, what does that mean?
We are obtaining information that can be future.
Yeah, so the most obvious thing is learning is just obtaining information, etc. So on the surface level, that's true, but I think that that is not exactly very productive. Now, I'm not saying it's a wrong answer, but I want to really get into what is learning. If we just pile on information, we don't understand the information, we don't really be able to act on the information. Is that really learning? And what I'm aiming at is a concept of understanding. And so this is a painting by Paul Klee, Swiss painter, One Who Understands. And this was in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And when I was growing up in New York and I went to medical school in New York, I used to study in the museum. I used to go to the museum and just study there. And occasionally I'd look at the artworks. And this is one of the artworks that I really liked. It's about One Who Understands. Now, it was in 1934 when the Nazis were coming in Germany. So his understanding was not exactly, I mean, he was learning something. He was learning something about humanity. He was learning something about his environment. It was actually a very disturbing understanding. And so the facial expression on this is very, not necessarily happy, but not necessarily upset, but sort of like this understanding. It's very hard to articulate, but this image kind of shows this calm, uh, sort of comfort with a hint of a smile, but not really, with a little bit of worry. It's a very complex feeling of understanding. So we have circles, lines, and points. They come together coherently. So this looks like a person, but it's obviously not. The fuzziness is dissipating. So we see this fuzziness dissipating, which is also kind of feeling with understanding, darkness separated from light. There's a neutral expression, as I mentioned, neither happy nor sad, but faintly satisfied with this understanding. So I think understanding is actually what we mean by learning. We want to achieve understanding and not just pile on information. So I will talk about how that happens. So first, let's talk about neurons. Neurons are the brain cells, the cells in the nervous system. There are two types of neural cells. There are neurons and glial cells. So neurons are the basic unit of structure and function in the brain and the nervous tissues. And their most notable quality is what we call irritability. It's the ability to produce an action potential. An action potential is a response to some sort of stimulus. And the glial cells are generally serving supporting functions. So what does a neuron look like? A neuron looks like, has two parts. It has a cell body called a soma, and it has an axon through this action potential or signal transmits, as you can see by the arrow here. So that's the basic neuron concept, a cell body called a soma and an axon. So what happens physiologically? That's the structure. Physiologically, signals arrive at the body and these dendrites, which is called a local potential. So there are small electrical changes. And then the signals are transmitted as a large potential or action potential. And then these signals are transmitted down the axon, which makes these signals go faster from the brain down to the legs and so forth. So how do these electrical signals work? Well, all cells, including these neurons, have what's called a resting potential. They actually have an electrical charge separation on their cell membrane, their surface, so that the inside is more negative than the outside. And how this works is there's high potassium on the inside, high sodium on the outside. In the resting state, the cell membranes are permeable to this potassium. The potassium goes out. And if potassium is positive and it goes out, then it leaves a negative behind. So that's how the membrane gets charged in this way, through the potassium permeability. So how does the action potential work? Well, as I mentioned, you have this resting potential of minus 75 millivolts due to the potassium. What if you switch the cell's permeability from potassium to sodium? Well, then the sodium will go in. If the sodium goes in, then the inside gets positive. So that's how you get this shift or action potential going from negative to positive. Very sudden shift of the cell, so it signals other cells. That's how the basic nerve cells in the brain work. They signal electrical fashion using these action potentials, which are sudden shifts in the permeabilities of these ions. And of course, those shifts are done by proteins and so forth. So this is how the action potential looks. It's a sudden spike like this going up from the negative to the positive. So each neuron is doing this action potential, but obviously in the brain, we have billions of neurons. So information, we're getting to this information concept, is transmitted from one neuron to another neuron via the synapse. So the synapse is the axon of one neuron. See the action potential here, connecting to another neuron, and there's a connection here with a space, and we call this presynaptic and postsynaptic. And three things can happen at the synapse. You can have a local excitatory potential, more positive, a local inhibitory potential, more negative. You can have a action potential, and the third change is some sort of biochemical change at the synapse. And this is the basis of learning. All those brain cells are in there, they're all connecting, and some are connecting better than others because of some biochemical strengthening of the synapse. Now I'm simplifying, of course, a little bit, but that's the basic concept. So we have electrical synapses like in the heart that don't learn. We have chemical synapses that involve these biochemical changes. And how does a chemical synapse works? It has the action potential, these little vesicles in the presynaptic cell. They travel to the membrane, open up, allow a neurotransmitter to go to the postsynaptic neuron. The neurotransmitter binds to a receptor and some sort of these actions occur. So you can see that here. Here's the resting potential. And then you see action potential. You see the neurotransmitter go. You see it go to the receptor. Then it changes the postsynaptic cell. And we get this concept of synaptic learning. So before learning, we see, maybe two receptors. I mean, this is obviously simplifying. After learning, we see much more efficient, more receptors, and a much more efficient synapse. And this is what Julia Minks was saying about repeating something. You repeat the synapse, it gets more and more stronger. So those brain cells associated with that information become strengthened. And this is the basis of synaptic learning. So what is long-term potentiation? Well, we can set up with these electrodes, we can set up some ways of measuring the electrical signals of a presynaptic and a postsynaptic cell. And then if we have long-term potentiation, which means we are stimulating the neuron so that this synapse here gets stronger. If we don't have the long-term potentiation, the result in the purple cell, the postsynaptic cell, is kind of small. After long-term potentiation, the result is stronger. That means that synapse is more effective. And Eric Kandel, who was one of my professors when I was in medical school, got Nobel Prize in 2000 for this work. There's also a close connection between sleep and learning. So during all this class and all the learning, you're making these synapses have a higher density. You're strengthening these synapses, and in sleep, you actually start to take away some of those synapses, some of the ones that were not so active. So it's kind of like making a Michelangelo sculpture. You do subtractive molding of the brain. You actually take away some synapses. So learning involves not just making new synapses and stronger synapses, but actually taking away from synapses and actually losing synapses. So you learn better, you learn more when you lose some of these ideas. Now, this is not just the nervous system, but also the immune system. So immune system, everybody knows about nowadays with the pandemic. We have vaccines, we have immunity, we don't have immunity. So how does the immune system work? Well, we have two types of tissues in the immune system. We have what are called central tissues and peripheral tissues. The central tissues are where the immune cells that produce antibodies and things like that are developing independent of the antigen. They don't see viruses, they don't see bacteria, they grow on their own. But then in the peripheral tissues, which means the skin, the lungs, where the body is interacting with the outside, those pathogens, the bacteria, the viruses, the development occurs in an antigen dependent fashion. In other words, cells that react to pathogens in the environment will grow more than cells that are not stimulated by antigens in the environment, which means your immune system is a kind of memory. Your immune system is a kind of brain that is a representation of all the exposures you've had in your life. Because, as I said, there's a kind of development in an antigen dependent fashion. But like Julia Minks was saying, you have to kind of sometimes remind it. So that's why we have booster shots with vaccines. You can lose the memory of this antigen dependent proliferation. So the adaptation learning takes place here. So that's why we have the primary immune response. So this is the antibody when we have an antigen such as SARS-CoV-2 virus, we have the primary response, and then the secondary response is the new response after a vaccine or after being exposed. You have more antibodies. So now let's start to talk about learning. So we both saw the nervous system and the immune system as a kind of learning, as a representation of the outside world. And we can have passive learning, which is the rereading, which is what Julia Minks mentioned, maybe 24 hours. We can have highlighting, which is what I think Tayal mentioned about practical application, but one of you mentioned about highlighting. And then I think it was Jiang, and then cramming. But this sort of passive learning doesn't last. It's what most students do. And to remember long-term is a form of active learning, to make a diagram, drawing to understand. So conventional learning, memory learning, and adaptive learning. So what is this active learning? What does that actually mean? What does it mean to make a diagram? So I will describe a concept to you that's very important. And I call it the difference between linear versus logarithmic learning. So here are two lines. Blue line is linear, and the red line is what we call exponential or logarithmic. On the y-axis, we will describe this as the number of brain cells used, more specifically, the number of brain cells used. If we learn more, we have to use more brain cells, right? On the horizontal axis, we have the amount of knowledge learned. So one of you had said learning is about getting information. So if we get more information, we need to use more brain cells. And in linear learning, the more information we learn, the more brain cells we use. It's just a very simple model of learning. But if you look at the logarithmic curve, you notice that at small amounts of information, small amounts of knowledge, we require more brain cells. So logarithmic learning is inefficient in the beginning. But later on, logarithmic learning, you need less brain cells to learn more information. So that sounds very strange. How can we learn more information with less brain cells? And why is it more difficult or to learn in the beginning? So this is probably the most powerful concept in learning, is that if you have a framework or a model of reality, and you add new information by connecting that new information to the previous model, you actually don't need as much brain cells, as much resources to remember the new information. instead you reinforce and build on the old information. That's why in the beginning, it requires more brain cells because you are concentrating on creating a model and framework. And then once you have that model or framework of reality, when you add more information, it's much easier and much more efficient to enter into this realm. So this is extremely important because if you're learning something about marketing, but you took a previous course about accounting, if there's a way you can connect what you learn in marketing to what you learned in accounting and build on it, that's a much more efficient way of learning. You make these connections between different fields. That's very hard to do in the beginning, but as you progress, you will have more and more information. You'll remember things much easier and be able to bring new information much easier. And that is what distinguishes top people from not so top people, because you spend time in your early years establishing this framework. I'll give you an example. If you have a mathematics background and you have a mathematics framework and you kind of understand mathematics, not just memorize it, and you look at this graph, everything that I say is very easy. So if I say a linear line, you already have a concept of that. So if I say adding more information linearly, you just add what I told you to your existing body of knowledge. And then you understand logarithms and exponentials. And I say, well, in the beginning, it's more, and then it gets easier. You'll add my information, the new things that I'm teaching you here, you'll add it to your existing framework. But if you have no idea of mathematics, what is a line? What is an exponent? What is a logarithm? If you have no idea, then you will learn this stuff for the first time. What I'm talking about is very difficult, not because it's difficult, but because you don't have a framework. So you have to devote more brain cells to learning what I'm telling you now. Whereas if you have a framework, if you understand these lines, you don't need as many brain cells to comprehend what I'm saying now. So that's a little bit abstract. So let's talk very practical. Elon Musk. And there was a recent article in the Entrepreneur's Handbook, Elon Musk's 2 rules for learning anything faster. So he said, this was an interview, so these are his words. 1 bit of advice: it is important to view knowledge as a sort of semantic tree. Make sure you understand the fundamental principles, the trunk and big branches before you get into the leaves, details, or there is nothing for them to hang on to. We begin to see Elon Musk's first rule of learning: make sure you're building a tree of knowledge. That's that early part that's more difficult. And then connections power your learning. The brilliance of Elon Musk's learning strategy isn't necessarily his ability to understand core central concepts. Many entrepreneurs have had solid grasp, but his brilliance is in his second rule of learning, which underlies his ability to build vast and towering trees across multiple sectors. Rule number 2, you can't remember what you can't connect. So Julia Mink said, well, in 24 hours, I reread. I think a better strategy, and I don't think it's a bad strategy, but a better strategy is to reread and connect to something else you know. So for example, we go back to the curiosity video and the curiosity webinar and the video games. Let's say you're an expert in video games. You have 2 possibilities. You have 2 routes. You can either trick the professor and trick yourself and say, well, I am an expert in video games and I want to make an easy assignment, so I'm going to watch a webinar on video games. Or you can take the second route, say, well, I take this project seriously. I want to be curious. I want to find something else. So you watch a video on cooking. You know, you never do any cooking in your whole life because you're busy watching video games or playing video games. But you decide you're going to be curious and you're going to watch a video about cooking. And then you see about cooking and you see that, well, maybe I can make a video game about cooking, you know, because there are lots of people who like cooking, and maybe they you know, can't cook day and night, but they want to play a game, and maybe they can, you know, beat some sort of video game about cooking. You know, a lot of video games about combat and army and building cities and whatnot, but maybe, you know, that's kind of old. Let's try something different, and a video game about cooking. So you come up with a connection. You connect the new thing with the old concept. So rule number 2, always try to connect the new knowledge to this previous tree. And now you can see why you need less brain cells, because if you're just connecting to previous knowledge, it's much easier to remember that new knowledge. So linear learning is what almost everybody does, but this logarithmic learning is what Elon Musk does. And in the beginning, it's not so easy. So you want to be establishing these frameworks and think about these core concepts. And then later on, well, now, as well as more increasingly in your life, you want to be adding to that tree. And we call this exponential growth. This is logarithmic, but it's actually exponential. So if you flip this curve around, the amount of knowledge learned for the same number of brain cells goes up exponentially. So how is this related to innovation? Closing thought. Stephen Jobs famously said, creativity is just connecting things. That's what we said at the beginning. And we just said that learning is about connecting things, connecting in the synapses, just as a matter of biology, but also connecting as a powerful way of this exponential learning that we talked about, like Elon Musk. So why is this important? Because we cannot really be innovative every day of our lives. We have to function. You know, innovation is really important, but you don't like innovate how you brush your teeth every morning. You don't innovate how you shampoo your hair every day. You don't change everything every day. We have habits, we have things we have to do. So innovation is extremely important, but it doesn't happen in everything. It happens sometimes. And in fact, people like Steve Jobs, who are very innovative, you know, they don't have millions of innovations, thousands of innovations. They have a few innovations, sometimes even just one. How do you set up your life to make that one great innovation or two innovations? Many people are lucky if they have one or two in their whole life. Well, you have to have a mindset that is prepared for that innovation. So I think the best way to do this is to learn as if you're innovating. In other words, if you learn by making connections, if you're constantly connecting your new knowledge, like what we talked about today about neurons, to existing knowledge, if you're constantly making the connections to learn, which is a practical task that you have to do, that's your job as a student to learn. If you're constantly learning by making connections, then you have trained your mind to make these connections for other things, bigger things, like innovating the next smartphone or whatever it may be. So this learning lecture today, building from neurobiology and so forth, is extremely important for your everyday role of learning, not just as a student, but forever. You know, we're always learning. But that type of learning sets you up to be really innovative in general, because you come naturally to making connections. You come naturally to making connections between a scientific idea and a business idea, between one business model and another business model, between one product and one service, and bringing them together, etc. You just get comfortable and very easy making these connections. So next time we will talk about innovation in academia and business, universities, corporate research labs, how that all works. We touched upon a little bit of it with Vannevar Bush, but we'll go into more detail. Okay, any questions?